to join us. And this would be a good time to silence your telephones, barking dogs, crying children, pacemakers, noisy pacemakers. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. Welcome back to Wheaton, or welcome to Wheaton. And we're glad you came to join us over here at the Wade Center. As you probably know, this is a collection and study center and archive and museum of 7 British Christians who combined intellect, imagination, and faith. And so we're here to talk a little bit about the interaction between 2 famous British Christian writers and their somewhat feisty relationship. I'm Dr. David Downing, and I'm here because of C.S. Lewis specifically, because we're having a program involving C.S. Lewis, but more broadly, I'm here because of C.S. Lewis's important influence in my own life. I grew up in a fundamentalist church, very good-hearted, but content with rather simple answers. And so I was struggling in high school and college about trying to, my faith felt a little bit like an intellectual straitjacket. And when I first read, my first book was Paralandra, and I said, what a more expansive view of spirituality and Christianity than I had encountered before. And as often happens with Lewis, I went from the first book to Mere Christianity, to Great Divorce, to God in the Dock, to the Narnia Chronicles. And it was extremely liberating for me to find a faith that was so intellectually compelling as well as spiritually nourishing. So it was an important part of my journey. I think Jim Elliot once said, Lord, make me a crossroads man. When someone meets me, they have to know whether to go this direction or that direction in their spiritual journey. And I think Lewis is very much a crossroads man in the books he wrote, as well as in person. So that's a brief introduction to me and my interest in the 7. And with me is, your name again?
I'm Dr. Crystal Downing, and I also, as a co-director, married to a co-director. That really worked out.
What are the chances? Wow.
And I am interested in Dorothy Sayers because of this guy. He became a C.S. Lewis scholar before I had interest in Sayers, and so he wanted to come to the Wade back in the 90s to study more Lewis documents. And I thought, well, I'm going to be accompanying him. I might as well have my own project. So I just chose the one woman in the collection of our 7 authors. And in fact, it looks like, are we even going to the same event? But I am wearing slacks in honor of Dorothy Sayers, because in a book she wrote, an essay she wrote in the mid-1930s, called Are Women Human? And by the way, she answered the question, yes. But Are Women Human? She talked about how women should be allowed to wear trousers. So she was challenging cultural constructions, not in spite of her faith, but because of her faith. How do we communicate better in the world? How do we become good evangelists for Jesus Christ?
Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about how do you respond to criticism. Paul said, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound. It's interesting to me that he said that in a way that makes you realize you have to learn how to be abased. It's not easy to be thrown in prison and whipped and almost drowned and also criticized. That's somewhere on the list of being abased. And also I know how to abound. You have to learn how to abound. It doesn't come naturally. But we're going to talk about situations in which they both faced criticism and how that was a part of their spiritual journey.
Including from each other.
So what happens when someone criticizes your style of evangelism, when they question your faith itself, even your intelligence or honesty for being a person of faith? How should one respond?
This was a really important question for me in grad school, because I had one peer in grad school who told me, Crystal, you're the only Christian I've ever met who's the least bit intelligent. And then a professor of religious studies, no less, when I told him I believed in God, I wasn't even talking about the resurrection. I just said I believed in God. I still remember he swirled his Chardonnay and said, my, aren't you an anachronism? So this issue of how do you deal with the arrogance of skeptics is something that was as relevant in Lewis and Sayers' day as in our own day.
So church history provides some helpful examples of responding to these sort of criticisms. The 19th century pastor, Harry Emerson Fosdick, was preaching, and a man stood up, a heckler basically, stood up and said, "I don't believe in God." And Reverend Fosdick said, "Tell me about this God you don't believe in. Chances are I don't believe in him either." I thought that was a good response.
And then when someone in a crowd told evangelist Billy Sunday that his preaching was too emotive, too manipulative, he asked, "Well, how do you preach the gospel?" And the guy says, "Well, I'm not a preacher." And so Sunday responded, "Well, I guess I prefer the way I preach the gospel to the way you do not preach the gospel."
And Lewis and Sayers also had their detractors. When Lewis was vilified in later life for his conservative views by a group of undergrads at Cambridge, he replied in print, "Their tone is too much that of personal resentment. They would rather wound the author than inform the reader. Criticism should diagnose and exhibit faults in the writing rather than heap abuse on the writer. Student critics need to distinguish between disagreement and a quarrel. I would rather be called names than to be proven wrong." Lewis wrote this many years after being attacked in print. He was used to it, both as a popularizer and an evangelizer. He called himself a regular pachyderm, audience participation, because he was so used to being attacked. He called himself a regular pachyderm.
Why pachyderm?
Who's studying for the SATs or the
Yeah,
GREs?
I heard it. Yeah,
Tough skin.
thick skin, like a hippopotamus, elephant.
So he was a dinosaur and a pachyderm. So you're in a good shape when you're an anachronism, you know.
Yeah, that's true. Significantly, when Lewis was asked what were the books that were most important for sustaining you spiritually, one of four authors he listed, was Dorothy Sayers. And that is why we need to take her seriously. Her collection of BBC radio plays, The Man Born to Be King, he found very powerful. Interestingly, she as well had to deal with detractors. However, hers were fellow Christians, and that can be even more painful. In 1940, Dorothy Sayers was invited to write these radio plays for broadcast on radio. And she took the commission very seriously. She spent a whole year rereading the Gospels, reading Bible commentaries, reading about historical contexts, so that by December of 1941, they were ready for a press release and invited journalists to come talk to Sayers, and she read some snippets from her plays. Well, the journalist turned it into this huge scandal. Imagine that. Boy, things have changed. And they played up the fact that she didn't use King James English. And in fact, she had her disciples speaking slang, and worse, sometimes it was American slang. So, protests were mounted all over England. Christian organizations were writing Winston Churchill, the Archbishop of Canterbury, demanding that these plays be taken off the air. One person sent Sayers a letter calling her "you old sourpuss." Another person accused Sayers and the BBC for the fall of Singapore to the Japanese in 1942 because these plays were put on the air. But Sayers held her ground. And the wonderful thing, and God works in miraculous ways, because this was a countrywide scandal, all these people who would never turn in to religious radio broadcasts turned it on just to see what all the fuss was about. And what they got was the gospel message. Sayers told C.S. Lewis later that she got thousands of letters from people who wrote her to say that they had been brought back to God or had their faith renewed or were turning to the Bible to read what it actually said.
I was hoping she would respond by writing the plays in Aramaic or New Testament Greek. So, you want authenticity? Here's your authenticity. So she did have a wonderful impact on many, many listeners, but not all of them. She received this letter from someone named L.T. Duff. Dear Madam, I heard part of your radio play last night, but eventually switched it off in disgust that such drivel should be given over the air and that a person of your standing should write it. I quite understand people of little education accepting and taking in such things as these, but you must have made research and inquiries into the actual so-called miracles. In view of your findings, I cannot understand why you should write a play based on a pack of lies. If you read about the events upon which your play is based, you will no doubt feel heartily ashamed of yourself for being party to such a deceit. Yours faithfully, L.T. Duff.
So, how does one reply to such an arrogant and insulting letter? It's hard enough to take constructive criticism, and yeah, it is. But how do we respond as Christians to ill-informed and mean-spirited criticism? Without considering the matter for too long, Dorothy replied in haste, L.T. Duff, Esquire. I am sorry that you should have sustained such a shock. Is this really the first time you have realized that a large number of educated persons profess Christian faith? Let me beg you not to agitate yourself too much. For a person of excitable disposition like yourself, it is extremely wearing to live in a constant state of virtuous indignation. Forget that materialism is out of fashion, that the physicists are all turning to metaphysics, and that psychologists have sapped the very foundations of rationalism. Console yourself with despising us. Nothing is more soothing than to contemplate the folly and depravity of one's inferiors. Yours faithfully, Dorothy Sayers.
Apparently, Sayers felt that she gave as good as she got, and that should be the end of the matter. But Mr. Duff replied the following week, Dear Madam, I was very pleased and also surprised to receive your letter. I actually did not think you would trouble to reply. I usually find that religious followers are quite content to sit smugly behind their Bibles and refuse to answer questions. Do you honestly believe in the virgin birth, the water turned to wine? That excitable person, L.T. Duff.
Again, Sayers replied in just a few days, this time in more measured tones. Dear sir, you complain that Christians do not usually reply to your attacks. Don't you think that perhaps they would do so if you addressed them with more courtesy? In your first letter to me, you accused me, a complete stranger who had offered you no personal provocation, of ignorance and dishonesty. I should not dream of using such ill manners to anybody, no matter how wrong I thought him. Had you expressed yourself with more civility, I might have answered you less tartly. Sayers goes on to ask Mr. Duff if he had read any contemporary works of Christian apologetics.
To this came Duff's prompt reply, Dear Miss Sayers, I can now see that my accusations were wrong, and I apologize, for there is no doubt that you have studied and read widely on this subject and honestly believe in what you say. But do you still believe in miracles? It is something I cannot quite understand. I have not read many modern books of Christian apologetics. I should be glad to know what you recommend. Best wishes for Easter. L.T. Duff.
Sayers responded the following week. Many thanks for your letter. It was nice of you to apologize. But she went on for 8 pages attaching an annotated list of 24 books on the collapse of modern humanism and the limits of science, as well as books of Christian apologetics, including Lewis's broadcast talks known to most people as Mere Christianity, The Problem of Pain, which Sayers loved. She thought it was brilliant, as well as other books archived here at the Wade Center, Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and Charles Williams' He Came Down from Heaven. Perhaps feeling that she still hadn't made her case, Sayers wrote another long letter 3 days later to C.S. Lewis. She was a great admirer of Lewis's screw tape letters, and her note to Lewis included a memo from a senior devil she made up named Sluckdrib, who refers to Sayers as his patient.
So this is Sluckdrib. A sound atheist of the old-fashioned materialist kind wrote my patient a highly offensive letter about miracles, accusing her of ignorance and dishonesty in the vulgarest language. I persuaded her to answer it still more rudely and defensively. This should have inflamed the situation. Instead, the man seemed to be pleased to have been taken notice of. His subsequent letters, though still discourteous and infidel, became more moderate in tone, and his latest effusion contained an apology and expressed some readiness to read some Christian literature, if my patient sent him a list. This I could not prevent her from doing, though I saw to it that her motive was mere pride and self-sufficiency, not in the least contaminated by love for the atheist or interest in saving his moth-eaten soul. He does not see the meanness of her motives, which would make a cat sick.
So, along with the memo from Sluckdrib, and this accompanied a first edition of her book, Man Born to Be King, which had just been put in print form. But she also included a note in her own hand. Thus says my attendant. Meanwhile, I'm left with the atheist on my hands. I do not want him. I have no use for him. I have no missionary zeal at all. The man keeps bothering on about miracles. He can't spell, and his mind is like a junk shop. If he reads any of the books I recommended, he will write me long and disorderly letters about them. It will go on for years. I cannot bear it. 2 of the books I recommended are yours. I only hope they will arouse him to fury. Then I shall hand him off to you. You like souls. I don't. God is simply taking advantage of the fact that I can't stand intellectual chaos, and it isn't fair. Anyhow, there aren't any up-to-date books about miracles. Please tell me what to do with this relic of the Darwinian age who is wasting my time, sapping my energies, and destroying my soul. Yours indignantly, Dorothy L. Sayers.
So Lewis wrote back 4 days later, I'm starting a book on miracles. Though it took 4 more years for the book to appear in print, it's clear that Lewis understood from the outset what Mr. Duff's problem was. On the first page of the book, Lewis explains, what we learn from experience depends on the kind of philosophy we bring to experience. It's therefore useless to appeal to experience before we have settled the philosophical question. As Lewis concludes the opening chapter of Miracles, those who assume that miracles cannot happen are wasting their time by looking at the text. We know in advance what results they will find, for they have begun by begging the question.
It's not known whether Mr. Duff ever read any of Lewis's books, but it is known that despite her protestations, Sayers continued corresponding with Duff, including another closely reasoned 8-page missive. It may thus be assumed that God can even use an ill-mannered atheist with a moth-eaten soul to inspire miracles, the book at least. One of the most influential works of Christian apologetics in the past century. Lewis, in fact, was so committed to Christian apologetics that in 1946 he tried to recruit Sayers to write a book to be part of a library of Christian knowledge for young people in school. She, however, replied that her conscience prevented her from writing merely to edify others.
Lewis responded, "I wish I knew what place an artistic conscience will hold a moment after death. You write such excellent letters that if I were a bad man, I should lure you into an epistolary controversy, and you would find you had written a book for us without even knowing it. I would simply publish the letters."
This suggestion did not comfort Sayers, who retorted, "Oi, oi! I see I must willy-nilly write you another letter. I've always realized that you were bothered about this business of art and edification, but I don't believe that God is such a twister as you make out. I don't believe he implants a love of good workmanship merely as a trap for one to walk into. I don't somehow fancy showing a lot of stuff to the carpenter's son one day and saying, 'Well, I admit that the wood was green and the joints untrue and the glue bad, but it was church furniture.'"
Now Lewis was getting a bit feisty. "Of course one mustn't do dishonest work, but you seem to take as a criterion of honest work the sensible desire to right the itch. This seems to me precious like making being in love the only reason for going on with a marriage."
This didn't help. "I do not care much for these sexual analogies of yours. But if you must have the thing in terms of love and marriage, then my position is that having deliberately thrown the girl at my head and done your best to compromise us, you are now trying to force us into marriage, regardless of the fact that she makes my flesh creep and that I have been engaged for years to another woman."
Lewis responds with words seen nowhere else in his writing. This is the first words of the letter. "Hey, whoa!" And then he proceeds with gracious humility, "Don't bother your head about my opinions or doubts anymore."
Sayers regretfully answered, "I apologize for having gotten so hot," and then writes a really meaty letter saying, "In your prophetic moments, you are with me, as when the corrupt artist in The Great Divorce is in hell because he's a corrupt artist. He has turned from serving the work by making the work serve him." This is key to Sayers' view of art. Rather than to write for polemical or didactic purposes, Christian creativity, including creative apologetics, follows the leading of God, God who created heavens and earth and saw that creation was good. Isn't it fascinating that in that first chapter of Genesis it says, "And God saw that it was good," and God saw that it was good. It doesn't say God proclaimed it good. God saw that it was good. It is in this very letter to Lewis that Sayers then explains how, because she refused to give people what they wanted in the man born to be king, which was King James English, the predictable, generic approach to the Gospels, that thousands of people came to Christ.
And so we see that what begins in disagreement can end in grace. The result that would not have surprised Sayers at all. She was keenly aware of God's ability to turn human failure into divine victory. As she herself concludes in her essay, The Triumph of Easter,
God did not abolish the fact of evil. He transformed it. He did not stop the crucifixion. He rose from the dead. As for the disciples' part in the drama, nothing could alter the fact that they had been stupid, cowardly, faithless, and in many ways singularly unhelpful. But they did not allow any morbid and egotistical regret to inhibit their joyful activities in the future. They had misunderstood practically everything Christ had ever said to them. But no matter. The thing made sense at last, and the meaning was far beyond anything that they had dreamed. They had expected defeat and beheld victory. They had expected an earthly Messiah, and they beheld the soul of eternity.
May we all go and do likewise. Thank you.
We are going to take some questions, and I can walk the microphone over to you if you have a question, because we are recording this, so please wait for me to get over to you before asking your question.
I heard somewhere that Sayers was not allowed to be part of the Inklings because she was a woman. Is that true?
It is not true. The reason she wasn't part of the Inklings is she lived in London and then outside of London, and the Inklings met at Oxford. But I will tell you that Sayers herself went to Oxford University, did all the work of the males at Oxford University, exceeding many by far, getting firsts. And yet, when she graduated for Oxford, she, like all women who went to Oxford, didn't get a degree because they didn't think women needed degrees. Now, after World War I, and significantly during the Great War, it was women holding Oxford together because people like C.S. Lewis and lecturers, professors, students were out at the front lines. And so it was the women, and it's kind of like Oxford has said, well, maybe we should give them degrees now. And so retroactively, she got her degree in 1920 or 21. They retroactively gave it to about only six women.
And we have the 1915 certificate, not the degree, that Sayers received in the archives here. So that's a neat piece of history.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Was it true as well, would you say, that since there were a lot of male-only clubs in Oxford at the time, that it would have been more unusual to have a woman in the club, despite the fact she lived a distance as well?
Yes, in fact, it was a bit controversial, and David can speak more to this because he's the Lewis scholar. Because Lewis then, when he met Joy Davidman, wanted to start bringing her to Inklings meetings, and they kind of had this unspoken agreement that this was more a men's club. Is that accurate?
I think that's true. Oxford is very clubby and very male-oriented. It was even unusual for Tolkien to be married and have children off campus. And so I don't think it was an official policy. It was just sort of the custom of the place. They often, the whole model, the German idea for a women's role is Kinder, Kirche, Küche, which is children, church, kitchen. And sometimes that model was fairly apparent in pre-World War II Oxford. And so they didn't think of their wives as someone who would come to an Inklings meeting because they didn't think of them as natural readers or debaters. Joy Davidman
Are women human?
She was from a very different mold, and Lewis thought that they would realize she was a different kind of woman, but they resented the fact that she seemed to have an exception to the rule.
Could you say a little bit more about Dorothy Sayers' view on creativity? I wasn't sure that I quite understood all the distinctions or the reasons for their disagreements.
Right. Sayers wrote a very important work during World War II called The Mind of the Maker. And she argued that the Imago Dei, which is mentioned in Genesis 1:27, for God created man in his image, male and female, he created them, is implying that we carry the Imago Dei. We are most like God when we're creative. After all, Genesis 1, God isn't a lawgiver, God isn't judge, God is creator. And that verse is embedded in the activity of God as creator. And so then she started theorizing what that meant. And theologians today still say that it becomes one of the most powerful apologetics for the Trinity, because she was saying anybody who is genuinely creative experiences creativity in a Trinitarian way. There is idea, energy, and power. And you get an idea, you put it into your painting or your writing or your dance, you give it energy, and then people respond to it and give it power. But she says, like the Trinity, that doesn't mean one succeeds another, because you don't even know you have an idea until the energy starts coming back to you. So it's like Father and Son are one, idea and energy are one. But the Spirit is part of that too, because you are the initial response to your own artistic work. And so she felt that because creativity was the imago Dei, to do something just to fulfill another person's desires, to be polemical and didactic, you are doing disservice to the imago Dei in yourself. Does that clarify it?
I think I would add that she had a number of experiences. She had very high standards for her own work, and there was this constant pressure to compromise. The detective fiction, she wanted it to be thoughtful detective fiction, even though it was commercial. When they tried to make one of her detective novels into a film, they did a very shoddy job. And she generally saw religious tracts and religious literature, and it just seemed second rate. So her stereotype was, you're asking me to lower my standards in order to do evangelistic work. I think that's what their discussion was. He felt you could do good evangelistic work without compromising your standards, and she wasn't too sure about that. Tolkien would agree with her. His famous essay on subcreation is very similar to her idea that we embody the Creator by creating our own imaginary worlds.
Since you brought up Lord Peter Wimsey, I'm just curious, and I know that often Lewis received criticism for some of the writing that he did that was more fictional. What was the response of the, should I say, the educational, the intellectual community to her writing in the detective fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we started with this idea of antagonism towards Christians. There is a famous 1953 book that was so popular it was reprinted several times, called The Emperor's Clothes, by a woman named Kathleen Knott, who talked about all these simplistic Christians that are writing, and actually has a line in her book saying, C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers were braver and stupider than most of the rest of the Christians. I mean, this real condescending attitude. Now, part of what fed that is they were writing at the height of modernism, where you just have this mystified, almost religious view of the artist as God who transcends culture. So people who wrote bestsellers, modernists, really looked down on anybody who would just pander to the masses, like Lord Peter Wimsey or children's stories.
But she also attacked T.S. Eliot, who had perfect credentials as an intellectual writer.
Well, and Virginia Woolf famously said after T.S. Eliot became an outspoken Christian, Woolf actually said, and Woolf is, of course, one of those high modernists, the Bloomsbury group. She said, there's something obscene about a person having tea and believing in God. But she used the word obscene.
I'm sorry, I just have to ask this. You said that Dorothy Sayers was one of the 4 favorite writers of Lewis that was spiritually sustaining. Who were the other 3?
You brought it up.
Okay, the reason he says it that way is they're not names you would probably recognize. Okay. The 3 others were mystical writers, or communicators of mysticism. I think David's best book that he's written is called Into the Region of Awe, which is about C.S. Lewis' interest in mysticism. And isn't one of them Bevan that he listed?
Yeah, Edgar Bevan had to do with understanding the nature of God throughout world religions. He said that in most religions, the divine is associated with light and height and agelessness. And then he traces these paradigms through Christianity. And so that was one. Dorothy Sayers' Man Born to Be King. He loved the idea. He didn't want the King James Bible to be this reverential book gathering dust in the corner. He wanted to speak to contemporary readers. That's what he loved about Man Born to Be King. He read it every year for Lent to remind him, this is real history. These are real people responding to Jesus. This isn't some sacred events that happened often.
And of course, the disciples were working class, so they would speak slang, right?
Oi, oi, it's the Messiah. That kind of thing.
Whoa!
But who were the other two authors?
You wrote the book. I don't know.
He wasn't Evelyn Underhill.
No.
They both loved Evelyn Underhill, and so did
Yes.
T.S. Eliot.
Right.
This is a little bit digressive, but I did this research on Into the Region of Awe, and the one line of hers that has just burned its way into my mind. She said, grace for Paul was not a theological principle. It was an actual inflowing of divine energy to transform us from our earthly selves to our spiritual selves. Yeah, and I think if you can get a hold of that one sentence, it gives you a whole different understanding of grace as an actual inflowing of divine energy, not just a theological statement.
One of the few works of Dorothy Sayers that I've read is her essay, The Lost Tools of Learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if there are any differences in how Lewis and Sayers approached education, learning, or what the similarities are.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. For many people, that is the only Sayers text they're familiar with because of, what is it called? The Classical Christian education, which was inspired by the lost tools of learning and goes back to medieval paradigms of education. I don't know about Lewis's view of education. Do you?
Well, he once someone explained to him how American education works, where you go to college and you collect credits, and you go through a semester and get 16 credits, you go through another semester and get 16 more credits, and once you've collected them all, you graduate. And he said, it sounds to me like a horse competition where you don't judge the horses by their strength or their speed, but by how much hay you've tried to feed them. So he wasn't too impressed with the American system. He definitely would be squarely in what we now consider a liberal arts philosophy. This is in Learning in Wartime. He talks about there's never a good time to stop and study and think and ponder. There's always some practical emergency we should be attending to. But he says if we always waited until everything in the world were safe and settled, we'd never get about the business of education. So he would be squarely in favor of a program like we have at Wheaton, where there's a lot of liberal arts foundations for one's whole life, not just for the first job one might get.
I've always loved Gaudy Night. It's one of my favorite books, and I feel like it's because it's really about her and her defense of education for women.
Yes.
Would you speak to that?
Yes. Well, you just summarized. I mean, there's real struggle, and again, this is way ahead of any feminist rhetoric. I mean, she's writing this in 1935 when she wrote the essay, Are Women Human? And so what is the relationship for a woman who wants to have an education, who wants to be a writer and have a career, especially in a culture in the 1930s that did not encourage that at all? And what's lovely about that novel, and what I love about Sayers is she subverts cliches like Man Born to Be King. She didn't use the King James English. And this is her one detective novel that has no dead body in it. But the real mystery is, how do you solve this as a woman? And especially if you believe in the Imago Dei, and that in Christ there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, that means women have the Imago Dei, that their creativity is how they show that they are created in the image of Christ. Now, she wouldn't say that creativity has to be in the arts. I mean, someone can be, creativity as a parent is very important. You don't just sit your kid down in front of a tablet, right? Or creativity as a chef. And so the creativity can be applied to any arena, but and especially for people marginalized in culture, to say, no, your creativity doesn't count. And I think that's why that novel is so powerful. Let's close. We've run out of the time that we had acknowledged, and we'll stick around if you have any other questions. But I want to close with the fact that was reinforced when C.S. Lewis's stepson came to visit us about a month ago. And we interviewed him. We're going to have that interview on the Wade podcast. We're starting a podcast scenario. I don't know the right word for it, so watch for that. And one of the questions that I asked Douglas Gresham was, tell me a little bit about Sayers. Did you ever meet Sayers? And he said, I didn't meet her, but the only time I ever saw my stepfather, C.S. Lewis, cry was when Sayers died. So that's a good way to end. Thank you all for coming and these great questions.
Thank you.